Chapter 23. Rock. Belderon's cry of joy sent chunks of snow into the wild air above the river. He jumped back from the cliff and looked down. Had he fallen in, he would have taken several breaths before he landed. Here he was overlooking his intended path, and it was still so far away. He looked around. He was on a ledge with cliff walls to either side. It was definitely the river the stones had sung to him about. There could be no other. He lay down on the snow to get a closer look, just as he did with the orchids. He peered over the edge at the magnificent, sacred river. Sacred because of its colors. Sacred because of its size. Sacred because somewhere up its long edge was his beloved Thervius. Belderon knew this river had touched his companion. Perhaps was even touching him now. Belderon's chest burned with hope. He scanned the rocky banks and then let his eyes come up his side of the rock. He studied the surfaces. He squinted, making out the jagged ledges of potential handholds and footholds. Perhaps he could climb down from this very spot. He looked around. It seemed to be the only option, other than back from where he had come from. He spun himself around on his belly and pushed backwards. His feet hung in mid-air over the cliff, and then his calf and knees. He clung deep into the banks as at last his feet hit the vertical rock and he felt for a place to stand. He tapped and caressed the rock with the toe of his boot until at last it gave him a foothold. With both feet secure, he pushed himself up and took a last glance at the ledge. His hands gripped the sharp corner. The rolled-up furs sagged at his back and pulled him toward the drop. He wasn't sure if there would be enough places to grab onto in his descent. He couldn't see that far down, but he had to try. The rocks were silent once again, but Belderon felt that they were at last allies. They had heard him. He had heard them. He was overwhelmed with gratitude, and he said so out loud. The sound of his own voice startled him, and he froze. Then he pushed himself down and watched the ledge disappear. He clung to the corner of the rock as his feet found lower ridges. Gradually, he began to move down. He continued his careful descent for hours until he lowered his right foot down and felt no hold. He dropped his head and let his eyes scan down the cliff. A flood of terror washed through him. Only a small space of rock kept him to the edge. The river roared far below. He turned his face to the rock and breathed deeply. He promised himself that he would only look at the stone to which he climbed, only look for the places to hold on. He scanned around below his feet for the next place to let himself down, but the next foothold was too far. "It's too far," Belderon whispered to himself. Futility poisoned every blood vessel within his body. He took his desperate gaze up to the cliff's edge. He would climb back up and follow the trail round to the other side of the mountain. There had to be another way to the riverbanks. He looked up for the outcropping to hoist himself upward and could not find it. It was gone. Perhaps the cold air was playing tricks with his eyes. They blinked and burned in the frigid wind. There was no going back. Belderon clung to the cliff as the fear sickened him and convulsed through his limbs. It seemed there was no way to move down, and he couldn't see the way back up. He was on the side of a sheer cliff wall and now beginning to doubt his senses. An angry resolution burned through him. He looked back down at the distant foothold. He would have to try. Down by his chest, he found two places in the rock for his hands. He gripped them tightly and lowered his body, lower and lower, until he lunged deeply, reaching down with his dominant foot. At last he felt it. He shifted his weight carefully over the extended leg. He brought the other foot off its edge and his hands to where the foot had just been. He sighed deeply, emboldened for the next step. He peered down the rock and saw once again that the next ledge was far. But this time too far, much too far. Impossible. Belderon stared desperately at the cold red and black streaked granite. Perhaps his view from the top had foreshortened everything, making the outcroppings seem closer together than they were. Again, he stopped. He glanced up and down. He was halfway down the cliff, with no idea how to proceed. The wind sang about him and licked at his ears. The river roared below. His last step had given him courage. There had to be a way down. From his desperate awakening in the grove, he was learning there was always a way to go, a direction to begin. From his walk among the snow orchids, to the music and song of the stones, to the phosphorescent tracks, something deeply mysterious and magical was leading him on. Wherever he was, however lost or trapped, he was discovering there was always a way out. He had gotten this far. There was no reason this place could be any different. He pressed his entire body to the rock. His legs shook slightly with exhaustion. They wanted to rest. Suddenly Belderon heard the sound of rock grinding on rock. His eyes flew up above him, expecting fallen rock, but the cliff was perfectly still. He looked down near his foot and saw a generous ledge where before there wasn't. It was as if the cold rock wall had peeled open like a flower petal. He stared in disbelief as another one opened near his hip for his hand. He placed his foot tentatively on the new opening and shifted his weight to it. He gripped his hand to the second one and shifted his weight down in one seamless, natural gesture. Then another grinding sound growled forth, and just below his other foot was a new surface on which to descend. The new ledges glittered in the morning light. The red and black streaks now glimmered as pink and gray. Again, Belderon glided his feet and hands into place as the cliff opened more ledges. Belderon grinned in disbelief, quickening his pace to the exhilarating cadence of grinding rock, which opened just as he needed a new support. As he descended, he grew more confident, often placing out a foot just as the cliff moved up under, and as his heart opened in exhilaration and gratitude for this assistance, he felt an increasing awareness of the intention of the granite, beginning to anticipate where it would hold itself out for his feet. Belderon was dancing with the rock. The sun moved up high in the sky. The river grew louder and then deafening, as Belderon at last placed one foot and then two on a large boulder at the base of the cliff. He looked up in awe at the completely composed cliff wall and then turned around to face the river. Chapter 24. Changes. All the Welfram gathered around the returned stone. Its attendant family stood by in quiet awe. When the stone left the continent, it was a dark gray granite, but now it gleamed in solid gold. It was round and smooth and brilliant in the sunlight, and its tones had been replaced with multiple voices singing a welcoming song. The music was exuberant, triumphant. The Welfram looked around in amazement. They were saturated with joy for which they knew not the cause. What was being welcomed? What had arrived? It was the shift, they decided. The voices were welcoming the shift, the great change that had initiated the stone's departure. The Welfram were so happy they returned to the work that had occupied them since time began. But then the gold stone turned. All the Welfram paused once again, facing the gold rock. It pushed itself into the ground and then was still. It rippled with light and seemed to sigh. Then it cracked at the top. Nobody moved. Slowly the tip of something green emerged. The music seemed to intensify as a tiny leaf poked out, then a slight tender stem, and a few more green leaves. Cracks rippled along the bottom as tender white shoots splayed out and searched for the ground. Once they made contact, the sapling began to grow rapidly. The stem shot up out of the earth, and the leaves soared into the sky, multiplying and spreading everywhere. The stem thickened to a sapling, and then a hardy trunk rippled with auburn bark. All the Welfram jumped back and then grasped each other in wonder. At last the growth came to a rest. It was the largest tree any of them had ever seen. It was bare all the way up its trunk and then fanned out its elegant arms over all of them below. The gold stone had parted into two halves that were embedded at the base, sending heat and nutrients to the cypress from the southern coast. Everyone recognized it for what it was, a tree from the faraway land. The stones intensified their toning in welcome, and the Welfram climbed over the great trunk and every leaf and limb. They whispered to each cell of the tree about how to thrive and flourish in this frigid environment. The tree heard everything, adjusting the contour of its cells, adjusting its auburn bark to a gray-blue tone, and deepening its roots over the musical stones. It was now the first Arctic cypress. It stood proudly in the snowy landscape and received welcome from every living thing. What very few knew is that the third and last effect of the shift had already begun. Its reverberations throughout Gren Amar held mystery and darkness, and the Welfram who witnessed it chose not to speak about it to any of their brethren. The river ran north over one single great waterfall. After that, it descended with massive grace over the lower elevations, where it passed through the Dragon Gorge and out to the sea. Not long after the demons' attack on Thervius, at the base of the waterfall, a massive slab of granite began to thrust up from the earth. It rose through the torrential pool and cut through the surface. It was long and massive, and it forged a cleft so marked that half the river began to run west. It flowed into a nearby valley and around the feet of a succession of mountains. The rest of the river receded from the banks, the current slowing with the lightening of its own weight. The risen rock looked like a giant dagger in the base of the pool, and at its top was an array of black soot that now began drying in the winter sun. As the water slowly receded around the particles, they moved across the surface and clung to each other. The dark dust began to vibrate in agitation. More and more, the scattered soot was pulling together so that the newly exposed rock became increasingly covered with crawling, aggregating ash. Chapter 25. Golden. Thervius stared into the stand of giant grass. Their broad green blades were as wide as his face and twice as tall as him. He had been running along the riverbank all day to keep warm, and now he was utterly cold and exhausted. He stared, puzzled at the giant grass that had once lined the river. Now they stood away from the confluence with a broad field of mud between them. The river had suddenly shrunk to half its size. He shivered in the dusk light, listening to the whimpering of the shrunken flow. His clothes hung in charred ribbons around his body. The exposed flats extended in the shadows, but there were flecks of gold throughout the surface. They grew brighter as the sun descended and night set in. Thervius stepped beyond the stands of tall grass and looked more closely. Something brilliant quivered in the fresh mud. Thervius focused his eyes and saw shimmering fish laying stranded all around. Thervius walked into the muck, thrust his hands into the coldness, and quickly grabbed a few for food. They were the size of his hand and the richest gold he had ever seen. He found a sharp river rock and roughly cleaned the fish, rinsing the fillets in the snow, and ate them raw. They were exquisite and filled his body with incredible heat. He tried to recall the last time he had eaten. He had been with Belderon at the cave. That had been ages ago. It felt like a dream, or even the life of another man. In his fatigue, the reality of the memory seemed just as diffused as the hope of seeing Belderon again. He blinked his eyes and shut it all away. Everything faded in the present need of his body to eat. He was ravenous. He quickly undid 5 more fish. Heat coursed through him, as if he had been laying on the shores of his sunny homeland. His skin was hot, and the lightly falling snow melted the instant it hit his brown skin. He began to grow sleepy. The only imperative Thervius knew now was the drive of his body. With his belly full, he stared blankly until he almost collapsed off the stone he sat upon. His mind could have wondered at how a half-naked man was remaining warm in the Arctic night, but it had long emptied itself and succumbed to taking miracles for granted. He walked over to the stand of grass and began pulling the large blades out of the mud. Up the bank and under a tree he made a hovel in the snow, lining it with the grass blades. Then he lay down and fell immediately to sleep. He landed firmly in the dream world, surrounded by a golden forest. The leaves flickered in the sunlight, and the golden trunks stood in the bluest water. The dreamtime Thervius moved through the warm water lazily, surrounded by trees that grew from the submerged bottom. He walked aimlessly until the brilliant blue that danced around his knees. In and out of the trees, the forest seemed to go on forever. Suddenly it opened, and Thervius stood in a watery circle. He stopped and looked around. Everything darkened, the sky, the trees, and then the water. Thervius looked down and realized the water was dissolving the flesh on his legs. Terror rushed through him, and he tried to yank them away, but something was pulling him down. 2 unseen hands clutched at his feet. They pulled, and he stumbled forward, finding himself at the mercy of an underwater assailant that he could not see. He screamed, but no sound came out of his mouth. Terror surged through him, and he cried out again. At last he woke up. From the tone of the darkness he could tell it was early morning. The air chilled him, and he stood up. He ambled forward and checked himself. Everything was intact. He turned and peed where he slept and then stepped to the river bank. The frost was biting now, and so he began again to run. The bankside was level and wide. The sun came up and showed itself briefly until it began to snow. Thervius felt the flecks of snowflakes hitting the skin where his chest was exposed. All his muscles tightened in anticipation of the speed and invoked more energy from within. His leg moved swiftly out from under him. His gaze fell lightly ahead, and with marked precision, he thrust each knee into the dim light before leaping into another stride. He bounded along the river until it began to darken. Once again he found the river grass and the golden fish that filled him with heat. Night after night, day after day, Thervius continued. He lost track of the days and was only aware of the simple rhythm of keeping himself alive. His thoughts stayed on the path so that he could keep from stumbling. Then when it was time, he ate the fish for nourishment and heat, and then harvested the grass for a bed. His body was always warm even though more and more of his frayed clothes were falling away. He always fell immediately to sleep, no longer dreaming, but sucking every bit of rest from the night.